Okay, calm down. You got rivers, man. You got rivers, man. Okay, calm down.
Hello and welcome to the Katie Halper Show. I hope everyone who celebrates had a Merry Christmas and is having a good Kwanzaa and a Happy Hanukkah. Next week, like this week, we will be doing our stream on Thursday, not Tuesday, because Tuesday is New Year's Eve and lots of people will be out celebrating. And that's why we didn't do Tuesday this week, because a lot of people were out celebrating Christmas Eve. So on today's show, I speak to three different guests. First, I speak to Tony Greenstein, the author of Zionism During the Holocaust, the Weaponisation of Memory in the Service of State and Nation. Then I speak to Rabbi Hershel Gluck and Jenny Manson, co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labor. As always, please give this show a like and also subscribe by hitting subscribe and then the bell. We're almost at 250,000 subscribers. We're at 244,000, so just 6,000 more to go. And you will definitely want to become a Patreon supporter of The Katie Halper Show if you're not already. At patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And if you become a supporter at the $1 a month level, you just get to make the show happen. You get to feel good and sleep well at night knowing that you make the show happen. If you become a supporter at the $5 a month level at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show, you get extended interviews and bonus interviews, including the full interview with Tony Greenstein on this week's episode. And you will definitely want to do that because he is a bottomless pit in a good way of information. He is a real resource when it comes to the collaboration between Zionists and Nazis, surprisingly enough, something that a lot of people don't know about. So without any further ado, let me bring on Tony Greenstein, who is the author of Zionism During the Holocaust, the Weaponization of Memory in the Service of State and Nation. He's also co-founder of Britain's Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So excited to be talking to Tony Greenstein, who is the son of an Orthodox rabbi, has written for The Guardian, Labor Briefings, Weekly Worker, Electronic Intifada, as well as other publications. He is the author of Fighting Fascism in Brighton and the South Coast and has contributed to a number of books, including The Essentials of Philosophy and Ethics and the Antisemitism Wars. And here is the amazing book by Tony, by the way, which is more of perhaps a tome. And it is Zionism During the Holocaust, the Weaponization of Memory in the Service of State and Nation. And I really can't recommend it enough. So welcome, Tony.
Yeah, hi, Katie.
Thank you so much for joining us from your...
Thank you for inviting me.
Brighton. Yeah. So I wanted to start off by talking about some recent events that you went through, and then we're going to get to your great book and a discussion about Zionism and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. But tell us what just happened to you on a personal political level.
Well, where do you want to start? I was arrested, if that's what you're referring to,
yes,
on December the 20th last year, when the anti-terrorist police descended on me on the basis of a tweet I had posted a month before, which they said supported a proscribed organisation, Hamas. They've since adjusted the charges, but that is basically the accusation that I have written or expressed an opinion or belief, in the words of the legislation, in support of a proscribed organisation. So it's not just me, it's happening to many other people. Anti-terrorism is being used as a way of closing down support for the Palestinians by saying that it's equivalent to supporting terrorism. So it's part of that war against the terror narrative.
Of course, we had Haim Brashith Zabner on recently.
Yeah.
And he also was spent a night in jail, was arrested and spent a night in jail over comments that he made at a speech, at a protest outside of the ambassador's London residence. His comments were, mostly descriptive. He just said that Israel would not be able to defeat Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. What were your comments, if I can ask, unless it'll get you arrested again and me not able to travel safely to England?
Well, they arrested me on the basis of a tweet. A Zionist said, just say 3 words, I support Hamas. And I said, I support the Palestinians. That's enough. But then I added a rider, I support Hamas as part of the Palestinian resistance in the war against Israel, or words to that effect. And that was what the arrest was on the basis of. And then last October, at the same protest that Chaim was in fact, he was one of the speakers, I made the comparison between Israel and Nazi Germany in terms of what it's doing in Gaza. And I referenced a comment I made, 4 years ago at the Palestine Expo, that Israel is Hitler's bastard offspring, which the Jewish Chronicle picked up and ran with a big headline about how notorious anti-Semite, anti-Zionist does it again. So on the basis of that comment, I was arrested for a racially aggravated offence. I was released 8 hours later, and they have subsequently notified me they're not pressing charges.
And that you were notified about that yesterday, right?
No. There's two separate things. They have to be kept separate. Okay. The arrest on the 20th, I appeared in court 2 days ago, and that was on the much more serious anti-terrorism charge, which carries a 14 years prison sentence. The arrest over the racially aggravated offence, they subsequently notified me I wasn't being charged, but that doesn't carry a prison sentence. It would be only a fine anyway. So it's quite amazing, really, they even thought of doing it. So I will be taking civil action against them as a result of that, because I was detained.
And where are you on the anti-terrorism charges?
Well, I appeared on, Thursday the 19th at Westminster Magistrates Court, which is one of it's the only court that can deal with terrorism charges. And I was formally charged there with, I think, 2 counts. One of expressing an opinion or belief which is supportive of a prescribed organisation. The second one is apparently I was also inviting support for them. So we will see how far these go.
Okay, got it. So we don't know what's going to happen to you on that case, in that case.
No, I'm remanded to the Old Bailey for the 31st of January, and then they will farm it out to a Crown Court. But it's all up in the air at the moment. So, and it could be another year before it's heard even. I mean, the wheels of justice grind slowly in Britain, I'm afraid.
Right. So to play kind of devil's advocate, you guys don't have the First Amendment, right? You don't have freedom of speech in England. So is it more in some ways consistent with your with the value system there, or lack of value system there?
Well, it's a good question, of course. But even if we did have a constitutional right to free speech like you do, in practice, when it comes to things like terrorism, I don't think you do either. Free speech isn't absolute in the US, and it's getting restricted by various court rulings. Supreme Court has whittled it away and so on. In Britain, we're supposed to be protected by Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which guarantees the right to freedom of speech. But, in this atmosphere, all the legislation in the world doesn't have a great deal of effect. I mean, Germany is trampling over any rights whatsoever. Even though the courts rule against the actions of the police, they act regardless. So you see the police acting as if we like the enforcers of the imperialist nexus, regardless of the courts. And the courts themselves in Britain are adjusting to the reality at a fairly alarming pace, because that's what justice is like in a capitalist system. It is the justice of those who rule, not those who are ruled.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So we interviewed Chaim Brashith Zabner. I also have interviewed in the past Adam Broomberg, who's part of this documentary that I'm doing on Holocaust survivors and their descendants who are speaking out against Zionism, which I would love to when I return to England. I want to interview you for that also, like do a proper in-person interview. But as I talked about with Haim, of course, the treatment of Palestinians who are not necessarily like high profile or don't have a big following, who knows how badly they're being treated.
Absolutely, yes.
Palestinian British people or Arab British people.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that I know in Germany, at least, a disproportionate number of people who have been arrested under anti-Semitism charges have been Jewish.
Yeah. We're not really Jewish in their eyes, because for them, being Jewish means supporting a racist and apartheid state, which serves imperialism's purposes. If we don't do that, then in their eyes, we're invisible as Jews.
Right. And they accuse us of contributing to anti-Semitism, which is very ironic.
Yeah, I mean, Jews are the moral alibi for imperialism in the Middle East. Bear in mind, the first Zionists were not Jewish, they were Christian. Lord Palmerston, Napoleon, Lord Shaftesbury, and so on, and Islah Haran. They all wanted a Jewish state long before the Jews did. And in 1840, Palmerston approached the Board of Deputies of British Jews to get them to support the idea of a Jewish return. And they really weren't interested. In 1842, they passed a declaration saying that it was no part of their business to encourage Jews to return or to go to Palestine. It was the anti-Semites who wanted Jews to return. It wasn't the Jews. The Board of Deputies and what was a bourgeois Jewish community were interested in emancipation, having full equal rights in this country, not being seen to be aliens. And in fact, the main Christian evangelical supporter of Zionism, Lord Shaftesbury or Earl Shaftesbury, he opposed emancipation in this country, but of course he wanted to see the Jews go to Palestine. So, I mean, that's always been the history, and the actions of the German police today are no different from the actions of the Gestapo in the 30s. Under Heydrich in 1935, the Gestapo published a proclamation saying that the non-Zionists were to be treated differently from the Zionists. And in fact, non and anti-Zionist organizations were banned from 1936, whereas the Zionist organizations were legal until 1939. So they're following in the footsteps of their Nazi predecessors, even though they proclaim that, of course, this all stems from the Holocaust. In reality, it's a continuation of the same policy.
Yeah, I mean, among the most disgusting things that were done in terms of performative hasbara, because of course the most disgusting things that have been done have been the things done in Gaza, but watching the Israeli ambassador to the UN come in with a Star of David on his lapel was absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, in Israel, I mean, there is a certain cognitive dissonance. On one hand, they openly proclaim the need to wipe out and exterminate the Palestinians, and don't see how that might just bear some similarity to what the Nazis did with the Jews. But if I go back to 1935, on the 28th of January, Heydrich, who was the deputy head of or chief of the SS, and Gerard Rettlinger, in his book The Final Solution, calls him the real engineer of the final solution, issued a directive stating that the activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organizations that were engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews lies in the interest of the National Socialist State's leadership. These organizations are not to be treated with that strictness that is necessary to apply to the members of the so-called German Jewish organizations, brackets, assimilationists. And in May of the same year, the paper of the SS, Schwarzkopf, wrote that the Zionists adhere to a strict racial position, and by emigrating to Palestine, they are helping to build their own Jewish state. The assimilation-minded Jews deny their race and insist on their loyalty to Germany, or claim to be Christians because they have been baptized in order to subvert National Socialist principles. So, I mean, they were very clear on making that distinction. And of course, that distinction is made today. So it is a continuation of the policy that the Nazis themselves formulated.
And can you explain what assimilation is for people who may not know? Because that has I think like a particular connotation, almost of like selling out, but it actually is a particular historical phenomenon.
Well, assimilation means, I suppose, that Jews assimilate to the majority but it doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of your Jewish identity. What it means is you become part of the society in which you are living. And that's cast as assimilation. It may well be that you are no longer Jewish. You may marry out. You may marry someone who's non-Jewish. Whether you retain your Jewishness is a personal choice in a free and democratic society. Where Zionism is really a racial preservation project. It wants to preserve the Jews as some kind of master race, in a sense, forevermore. An artificial construct, which we see in Israel today. And of course, the question for the Zionists in Israel is still the same as it was in Germany. Who is a Jew? That bedeviled the Nazis. They had conferences over it. They couldn't decide the Mischlinge. Were they Jewish? Were they Aryan? Or what were they? The same is true.
The Mischlinge? Sorry, what term? I didn't.
Mischlinge. It means a Jew who had one or two Jewish grandparents. There was actually a first degree Mischlinge who had two Jewish grandparents, and a second degree who had one. If you had three or more, you were Jewish. But if you had one or two, then you were half or a quarter Jew. And that bedeviled them. Were they Jewish or were they non-Jewish? Just as in South Africa, the question of who was a white was not an easy... Because race is not a scientific concept, it's a social construct. So they had great difficulty matching it up. And in the end, being Jewish was defined in accordance with practicing Judaism going back to 1870. So it rested on what your grandparents adhered to in terms of their religious practice. So it wasn't a race.
This is according to who? Sorry, whose definition was this?
The Nuremberg Law definition.
Okay, got it.
1945.
So if you had one practicing Jewish grandparent, you were Jewish?
No, you weren't. You were quarter Jew. So in practice, you were not Jewish, unless you yourself were a practicing Jew.
Got it. Yeah. So does that mean you wouldn't be sent to a concentration camp?
It wasn't a guarantee, but you were much less likely. The Mischlinge in general survived. In Germany, they did, but in Eastern Europe, they wiped them out anyway. Yeah, although they weren't supposed to. But in Germany, you had a much higher chance of survival if you were a Mischlinge for one Jewish grandparent or two Jewish grandparents. It did mean you'd be drafted into the German army, though. But there was a German general who, Milch, I think his name was, or he was a field marshal who was a Mischlinge, for example. So in general, they survived. It doesn't mean they weren't harassed to some extent, of course. And also Jews who married non-Jews were called privileged Jews, and therefore they also tended to survive, but they suffered severe harassment. And the non-Jewish spouse was pressurized to divorce them, and so on.
Right. Another person that I've interviewed for this documentary is Marion Ingram, who's from Hamburg, whose father was not Jewish. Her mother was, but actually the mother got a deportation order. And Marion, as a child, apparently walked in to the apartment and her mom had put her head in the oven because of the deportation order. So, well, before we go on about the history, I do want to ask you about your personal evolution, because you were not raised by anti-Zionists. You were not raised in an anti-Zionist home. Can you talk about your transformation trajectory?
Yes. I mean, my father was a traveling rabbi, so we went to a number of different provincial communities, ending up in Liverpool. So for the first 11 years of my life, I went to non-Jewish schools. And in Wales, where I went for the final year, it was a heavily Labour socialist miners' constituency. So by the age of about 14, 15, I was already a socialist. And my socialism and then Marxism conflicted with Zionism, because for Zionism, what matters most is being Jewish, regardless of class. For socialists, unity of the working class, wherever they're based, is the primary concern. So although Zionism has pretended you can be a socialist Zionist, that pretense has disappeared long ago. I mean, the Labour Zionists are no different from the right-wing version. I mean, they were the ones who carried out the Nakba, for instance. So I saw the incompatibility, and I was involved in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. That was my first demonstrations when the rugby tour came to England, the Springboks, in 1970. So I was involved in that, and from that, I began to understand the Palestinian question. And there was a debate at my school. I was in a Jewish school, and it was about Zionism, whether it was right or wrong. And I played devil's advocate because no one else would take the debate. And in the process of researching it, I realized that everything I'd been told had been a fable. You know, I was told, and I'm sure you were told, that
I wasn't raised Zionist.
you were. Oh, right. Well, I was. And
I'm a red diaper baby's baby. So,
all right. Well, I was told, and it's very, very common, that the reason there was a Palestinian refugee question was the Arabs ran away on the orders of the Arab armies. And we know in 1961, Erskine Children, Rashid Khalidi, investigated this, and they looked at the BBC and the CIA transcripts of the Arab broadcasting stations. But not only were there no orders to leave, but there were orders to stay. And of course, it fell into place. If you want a Jewish state, how can you possibly have a majority who are not Jewish?
Right, of course, right. It's interesting because Gabor Mate was also a Zionist, and he had an aha moment when he was assigned by Zionists to represent the anti-Zionist position as a kind of like intellectual exercise in order to, like know your enemy. And once he investigated that, that's what made him realize that it was one of the few things that made the scales fall from his eyes when it came to Zionism. So were you a true believer before this point, or were you kind of uninvolved?
I mean, I had volunteered, for instance, to deliver packages for the Jewish National Fund, and I was, like most Jews, exhilarated by the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, and so on. So I suppose initially I was a Zionist, and then gradually I came to realize that it wasn't such a good thing. It was a process, as a child, you assimilate the ideas of your parents and those around you, and then you start to develop out on your own. And obviously that's happening to more and more Jewish kids today as they see the reality of Israel. It's no longer the case that, see, when I was brought up, we were always told, we want peace, but the Arabs won't talk to us. But no one can pretend that now. And it's very obvious that Israel is an expansionist apartheid state. You'd have to be blind to not realize that. But in those days, you could be on the left and be a Zionist. But that is not possible now. I mean, they used to hold out the kibbutz as the kind of ideal socialist experiment. I mean, and in the Labour Party, I mean, it was the left who were Zionist, and the pro-Arabs were on the right. Of course, that's no longer the case. The right is uniformly pro-Zionist. It's a badge of identity for them, whereas the left now is primarily anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian or both.
Right. Not that Labour represents the left, right? Because they're as bad as the right.
Well, today, Starmer's Labour, of course, is as bad, as you say, as bad as the right. They're carrying out the programme of the right.
Right. And did this cause friction with your within your family?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, my first rebellion was not over Zionism, it was over religion. When I told my father at the age of 14 I was an atheist. So that was our first falling out. So the anti-Zionism stemmed from the rejection of the religion. I guess I was a kind of rationalist, and that's why I became a Marxist, because I could see the failings of capitalism. So anti-Zionism was a progression from that.
Right. So let's talk about this amazing book. And before we start with the connection between Zionism and Nazism, can you talk about how Zionism was, as you referred to earlier, a Christian idea? A lot of people, I think, confuse the religious call to go back to Israel with political Zionism. And as you point out, political Zionism started, it was a Christian thing. A lot of people also know about Christian Zionism, but they think it's a recent thing with the evangelicals, like Pastor Hagee, for instance. So can you correct that?
Yes, I mean, the Roman Catholic Church believed that it was a successor to the children of Israel. The Jews had forsaken Jesus, and therefore they'd abandoned their covenant with God. So the Catholics represented the true children of Israel. The Protestants, the Reformation, overturned that idea. They believed that the Jews in Europe constituted those who'd been expelled, apparently, and they were the true inheritors, and therefore their mission was to return. So the idea of a return to Palestine was very common in the post-Reformation, Renaissance, and then Enlightenment era. And that was an ideological commitment that stemmed from the fact, if you like, that Protestantism was the kind of religion of capitalism, of colonialism, whereas Catholicism was a religion of feudalism. So you had that ideological, if you like, environment. And then imperialism began to fasten on the idea, starting with Napoleon in 1799, who wanted a Jewish state in Palestine, because they saw it as to the advantage of imperialism. And in 1838, Britain appointed its first consul in Jerusalem, called the Protector of the Jews, because that was their rationale for establishing a presence in Palestine, because Palestine was seen as a very important strategic area. Although the Suez Canal had not yet been built, it was still the trade route through to India in many ways. And then the Suez Canal was built, and that made it much, much more important, because for Britain, India was the jewel in the crown of the empire. We extracted great wealth from it. So having a stable settler state adjacent to the Suez Canal was extremely important. But even before the Suez Canal, and of course, there had been all the talk about cutting through the canal. In 1840, as I say, Palmerston approached the Board of Deputies of British Jews to get them to issue a statement in support, but they were very reluctant. They didn't want anything to do with it. It wasn't part of their priority. In 1842, they issued a statement very clearly saying they did want no part of support for Zionism, which was a non-Jewish phenomena. And not only at the Board of Deputies, in 1885, the Pittsburgh Declaration of Reform Rabbis in the United States similarly said they wanted, any idea of the return to Palestine should be excised from the prayer book. We are simply Jewish members of the American people, if you like. We're not a separate nation. So it was the non-Jews and it was the anti-Semites, because the evangelicals were also the flips coin of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semites also loved Zionism because it got rid of the Jews in their midst. And so you had this kind of devil's alliance, if you like, between Zionism and anti-Semitism, which has persisted up to this very day. I mean, people like Trump, they're anti-Semitic, but extremely pro-Zionist. Hagee said that, that Hitler was God's instrument in driving the Jews to Palestine. In a sermon he's tried to excise from the internet. But
who said that? Sorry, I didn't catch the name. Who?
John Hagee.
Oh, Hagee, yeah.
Hagee. He said that Hitler was the instrument of God. He was doing God's work in driving the Jews, these wretches who didn't want to go, to Palestine. And that's part of that kind of theological discourse, in a sense, and Hagee is part of it. So, I mean, that's really what the situation is and was, that the anti-Semites loved Zionism because it accepted that Jews did not belong where they lived. And, you know, I mean, Herschel is on record as saying that the anti-Semites will be our most dependable friends, and that the anti-Semitic countries are allies. And that's in his diaries. And there's much else besides. I mean, he said anti-Semitism is the driving force of Zionism. It is the steam engine, if you like. So, I mean, that was the basis of all the collaboration that followed, that the anti-Semites said, get out, and the Zionists said, we're only too willing to do so.
Right. Can you talk also about how recent a phenomenon Jewish Zionism is? Because a lot of people assume that Jews always wanted to return. And you, of course, have argued very convincingly, and it's based on evidence, that that's just not the case.
No, it's not. I mean, when political Zionism...
And I should put return in quotes, by the way, return, yeah.
Well, yes, of course, because we were never there. European Jews, there's no reason to believe that European Jews ever descended from the Middle East in the first place. I mean, there are various theories about where they and how they originated, but it's a racial myth. But Jews, when Zionism came on the scene, the Orthodox were vehemently opposed to it because it was contrary to everything they believed, and it was forcing the hand of God. So they opposed it on that basis. And Agudat Yisrael, which is now in the Israeli Knesset, was formed in order to oppose Zionism. The old Yeshuv, as Chaim Weizmann called them, in Palestine, because in the middle of the 19th century, Jerusalem was already a majority Jewish city. But it consisted of the Orthodox who went to Palestine in order to study and to pray. They were subsidized by richer Jews in the diaspora, but they had no political ambitions. They lived as part of the kind of matrix, if you like, of religious minorities in Palestine and in Jerusalem in particular. There was no conflict. There was no intention to form a Jewish state or a Jewish supremacy. I mean, it was unheard of. And so when the Zionists came, they were most unwelcome because they were upsetting everything they had established. Theirs was a religious motivation. But of course, the Zionists had a political ambition which superseded that and was simply used religion to cloak its own ambitions. But Jews never really wanted to go to Palestine. I mean, it's in their prayers about returning, but all that meant, as Bernard Lazar said, was next year I want to be free. Nothing more. When 2.5 million Jews emigrated from Russia as refugees, 99% of them went to Britain, France, and most of all, the United States. Barely 1% went to Palestine. There was nothing to stop
And they could have.
Yeah, there was no immigration barriers. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, you didn't need a visa in those days. You didn't need a passport. You could go, and actually a majority who went came back because the land wouldn't support them. So Zionism was always subsidized from its beginnings. That was the only way it could get off.
What do you say to the claim that, sure, Jews weren't supportive of Zionism until they realized how anti-Semitic the world was, and they learned that during the Holocaust, and that's how we know that Zionists were right, and you and the other people were just naive?
Well, Zionism was never an answer to anti-Semitism, and it saved no one from the Holocaust. On the contrary, I mean, the Zionist record during the Holocaust is so appalling that if it hadn't existed, probably it would have been 5 million plus Jews. It wouldn't have been 6 million plus. So on any scorecard, I mean, Zionism really did not fulfill any particular purpose for Jews. I mean, you had Ben Gurion openly saying given the choice between sending Germany's Jews, all of them to England or half of them to Palestine, I prefer the second course, because we've got to think of the history of the people of Israel. And throughout the war, the Zionists opposed any rescue scheme which wasn't Palestine. But in Germany, 2% of Jews were Zionists when Hitler came to power. Zionism was not popular. It was seen as a concession to anti-Semitism. It never fought anti-Semitism. It wasn't an answer, because if it was an answer, then presumably there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. So it utterly failed. It didn't prevent the Holocaust. And even, I mean, those Zionists who did fight in the ghettos and so on, were told, and I give examples of Haj Klinger and others in my book. They were told to get out, to leave. They were provided with Palestine certificates. They were told the real fight is in Palestine against the Arabs, not against the Nazis in Poland. To their credit, they absolutely refused. They said, "We will die here. We are part of our people." And then when they came to Palestine or Israel, they were bitterly critical, but they were silenced. And their memoirs were rewritten, and their diaries were rewritten. And it's only relatively recently that we've had the unexpurgated versions. But I mean, what was produced by the Zionists, it was the left Zionists, Hashem Hatzer, Mapam, who completely altered what they'd said to eradicate and erase all trace of their criticisms. And Heike Klinger, in particular, in a lecture to Histadrut in 1944, spoke about the hatred for Zionism of the diaspora Jews, because they were the collaborators. The Judenrat, the Jewish council, 2 out of 3 of their members were Zionists. And they were hated, the Judenrat, because they were the ones who selected the Jews. They were the ones who rounded up the Jews. You've heard of Israel Shahak, who was he was professor of organic chemistry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he was one of the very first Israeli anti-Zionists. He wasn't on the left particularly, and he was a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, and he described how during the Great Action from August to September 1942, when the majority, 300,000 of the Warsaw Ghetto Jews were rounded up for the deportations. It wasn't the Nazis who did it. It was the Jewish police of the Judenrat. It was Jews themselves who were undertaking these tasks. And he said there was hatred. And everyone who witnessed it said there was hatred. But the Zionists today defend the Judenrat because their members were involved. So they speak of resistance on the one hand, and yet they defend the Judenrat. And that's trying to square the circle, and it doesn't work.
To be fair, the Zionist project did bring some Jews out of Europe, right? But you could easily argue that they prevented, in other words, like the net number of Jews was lower than it would have been without their intervention, given the way that they got in the way of certain rescues, right? Like they rescued people who they thought were good for Palestine, but got in the way of the rescue for others.
Well, during the war, they had something called Aliyah Bet, the illegal emigration to Palestine. And that was solely about rescuing Zionist activists. And there were discussions in the Jewish Agency executive about how we must differentiate between Zionists and anti-Zionists. And we can't bring our enemies amongst the Jews here. Of course, Palestine by that time had become a refuge for 200,000 or 300,000 Jews. And that's fine. But many of them would have gone to the United States or elsewhere. And you wouldn't have had a Jewish political entity actually campaigning against lowering the immigration barriers in the United States, and to an extent in Britain as well. The major rescue of Jews from Germany who came to Britain was a kinder transport after the Kristallnacht. And the Zionists were extremely unhappy about it because they weren't being sent to Palestine. And I detail in my book both Ben-Gurion and Weizmann's opposition to it. So it doesn't matter. How many went to Palestine, many of them, I should say, would have gone elsewhere. I mean, of the German Jews who went under the Havarah scheme, this was a trade transfer agreement of August 1933, they were primarily the richer Jews who would have got out, could have bought passage to anywhere, because you had to have £1,000, which was maybe 90,000 pounds now. So they were the least affected. It was the poorer Jews, of course, who couldn't buy their way out, who were in peril. But Zionism itself was a counsel of despair amongst the Jews. It said you couldn't fight antisemitism because it was inherent in the non-Jew, and therefore all you could do was acquiesce at best. I mean, there were different reactions amongst different Zionist groups within Europe. Some wanted a national minority status, like in Poland. Others, like in Germany, accepted the kind of blood and soil racism of the Nazis and their supporters, and accepted that they didn't belong. But you had, I mean, however many were rescued by default in Palestine, the fact is that Hungarian Jewry, the majority would have survived if it hadn't been for the bitter collaboration of Rudolf Kastner, which came out in Israel during the 1950s. They don't talk about that now, but that case, yes. I mean, it starts really with the escape from Auschwitz of Rudolf Verber and Alfred Wetzler, two Jews who escaped on the 10th of April 1944 because they got wind of preparations being made in Auschwitz to receive the last major Jewish community that was surviving in Europe, which was in Hungary, something like 700,000 Jews. And the Nazis, on the 19th of March, occupied invaded basically Hungary, because Hungary had been looking towards dropping out of the alliance with Nazi Germany and joining the Allies. And Hitler got wind of that and put a stop to it. They invaded on the 19th of March. So Verber and Wetzler escaped on the 10th of April, and they reached Slovakia, which is where they came from, on the 24th of April. And they set down what they knew about Auschwitz, which had up to then been thought of as a labour camp, not an extermination camp. In fact, it was both. It was both a work camp and an extermination camp. And you need to be clear about the differentiation. Most camps were labour camps of one form or another, concentration camps. But a few, like Belzec, like Treblinka, like Chelmno, were extermination camps, and only extermination camps. And you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who survived or escaped from there. I mean, in two of them, Treblinka and Sobibor, there were revolts from the workers who had been chosen to survive there. But Verber and Wetzler set down what they knew. They provided maps, they drew what Verber had counted, and he had a remarkable memory, and he estimated that 1.75 million Jews had already been exterminated in Auschwitz. And this became known as either the Verber-Wetzler report or the Auschwitz protocols. And they were given to Kastner, who visited, because Slovakia was kind of the junior community compared to Hungary. Slovakia had been the first country to have deportations take place in 1942, but they'd stopped, and there was still now about 30,000 Jews remaining there. And Kastner came to Bratislava every month, and he was given a copy of the Verber-Wetzler report. But he took the decision not to publicize it, but to suppress it, as did Nathan Schwab, one of the Zionist representatives in Switzerland, who was also sent a copy. And the reason was that Kastner had entered into negotiations with the Nazis, Eichmann and his deputy Krumi, to have a train out of Hungary for the Zionist and the Jewish elite. At one stage, at the beginning, they were offered 600, but that was increased to 1,684, say, Zionists and the Jewish elite. But the price of that was not only silence, but we know in the case of Cluj, Kolosvar, which was Kastner's hometown, they actively misinformed people that they would be going to a fictitious place called Kenya Maze, and indeed encouraged to get on the trains because the first people on them would get the best places, and so on. So that's exactly what happened. But of course, being towards the end of Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was closed down at the end of October, some people survived. Not many, but some. And they came back looking for revenge. And the witness testimonies on in the Kastner trial, which I'll go into in a minute, made it clear if Kastner had shown his face in Kolosvar, he would have been killed. Such was the hatred for him and what he and his fellows had done. Because, of course, the Zionists didn't go join the trains to get the best places in Kenya Maze. They went on this train to Switzerland via Bergen-Belsen, and they survived. But in 1953, Malchiel Greenwald, who was a kind of pamphleteer, he was a refugee from, I think it was Hungary. He was a member of Mizrahi, which is a Zionist religious group. He was also a pamphleteer and eccentric and so on. And he used to pen these quite vicious newsletters targeting his enemies, and Kastner was one of those. And he wrote openly that, Kastner was a collaborator and so on, in quite vivid language. And Kastner had already been accompanied by various allegations which he'd managed to have silenced or downplayed. But the Attorney General and the Israeli government made the absolute mistake of saying to Kastner, who was a candidate for Mapai, the Israeli Labour Party, in the next elections, you have to sue and the state will support you in suing him for criminal libel. And that's what happened. And so the trial began in 1954. And with the appeal, it lasted till the middle of 1958. And at first, the judge, Benjamin Halevi, approached the defense and suggested that if they conceded, he wouldn't be too harsh in his sentence. But the defense was led by Shmuel Tamir, who was, an utterly right-wing Zionist. He ended up supporting Mayor Kahana and Kach, and he was in the gun. But nonetheless, he was a very brilliant lawyer, and his cross-examination of Kastner started to unravel the truth. And one particular lie which did it for him was when he was asked about the fact that he testified in favor of Kurt Becher, a colonel, Himmler's personal economic emissary in Hungary, and he denied flat that his testimony had led to his release. And then the affidavit was produced, and Kastner was basically sunk. It later turned out that Kastner not only testified for Becher, but for Krumi, who was Eichmann's second in command and in charge of the deportations in Hungary, Dieter Wisłoceni, whose hands were covered in the blood of the Slovakian Jews, the Greek Jews, the Polish Jews, and so on, who'd taken in people who thought he could be bribed when he couldn't. He tried to intervene for him to have him recalled from Czechoslovakia, where he was hanged, but it didn't happen. Lieutenant Hans Juttner, who was an SS general, again, he had an appalling record. I mean, all of this came out later, but Kastner was basically going around trying to exonerate some of the leading Nazis in Nuremberg, and the American prosecutors were getting rather pissed off with him as a result of this, because he was looking for Nazis to save. But, I mean, in essence, he was a Gestapo agent. I mean, that's the conclusion one has to draw. But to this day, the Zionists defend him. I mean, Yad Vashem has rehabilitated him. Yehuda Bor was his major defender. He's just died, the chief Holocaust historian, because Kastner was a representative of the Jewish agency in Nuremberg. he wasn't just speaking on his own behalf, but on behalf of the Jewish Agency and the World Jewish Congress. And then to this day, they haven't disavowed his testimony. So Benjamin Halevi came out with this verdict in 1955, a very long judgment, 300 pages, that Kastner had sold to Satan. And when the government appealed, the general Zionists walked out. Mapam rebelled, and the government fell. So the second government of Moshe Sharett, or Moshe Chertok, as he was renamed, fell. So, I mean, that's how serious it was. It led to the collapse of the government and, in essence, the return of Ben-Gurion, who had walked out for his own purposes. So it had a major traumatic effect. Kastner was assassinated, I think it was 1957, because they couldn't keep him alive, and the Jewish Agency leaders in the trial had lied about not knowing anything about Becher, where some were up to their neck in it. You had all these survivors who testified against Kastner, and they had others who testified for him, who'd been rescued on the train, of course. So, this was just highly, highly embarrassing and led to the Eichmann trial. Although the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court in Israel, acquitted him by 4-1, you had a situation where one of the four, I think it was Goiten, said although he was acquitting him, it was on technical grounds that you have to uphold all the libel charges, where you can't just uphold some of them. And on those grounds, he acquitted him, but refused to acquit him in collaboration. But even the Supreme Court said in the case of his testimony to Becher, he had lied and he had collaborated. So it wasn't a full-scale acquittal, even on a 4-1 verdict. But Moshe Silberg delivered a quite devastating minority opinion, which I quote in my book. So the question was how Zionism could get out of this, in a sense. And the way was the Eichmann trial, the capture of Eichmann in Argentina in 1960 and the trial in 1961. And they took great care that no one associated with Kastner would go over that record. So Zionists were excluded. Verba was excluded because they couldn't afford his fare from London. Now, if you believe that, you believe anything. Of course, he wasn't called because Verba, who had emigrated to Israel from Czechoslovakia, decided he didn't like it and came to London and then Canada, would have said a number of things about the Zionist record in Hungary, none of which would have been in accord with the narrative they wanted to develop. So they weren't going to have him on the stand. So the majority of witnesses had never met and never seen Eichmann. So it was a show trial. I mean, no one doubted Eichmann was guilty, but that really wasn't the purpose of the trial. It was to, if you like, to recreate for Zionism a new narrative, because after the war, people didn't want to talk about the Holocaust. I mean, I quote that in my book, Hansi Brand, that when I talked about my war, the Holocaust, and what had happened to me, they wanted to talk about their war, and so on. The Holocaust was seen as the worst example of the diaspora, the sheep who were going to the slaughter. We were the new Jews. We weren't the gutter ghetto Jews of Warsaw. We fought. The example that was given was Masada, the Roman complex, where the zealots apparently committed suicide rather than surrender. This was the model.
Perfect metaphor. Although better than the Hannibal one, I guess.
Yeah, well, that came after.
Yeah,
of course.
Right. Can you also talk about one of the people that you dedicate your book to is Marek Edelman. Can you talk about that figure?
Yeah, well, he was the leader of the Bund in the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, although the first commander was a Zionist, Mordechai Anielewicz, because he had military experience. The Bund comprised the major fighting part of the resistance.
And can you give a sentence explanation for people who don't know what the Bund was?
Yes, of course.
And that was Tony Greenstein. And to hear the full interview with Tony, which, as you can probably tell, is definitely worth it, become a $5 a month member of the Patreon at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Now on to the second interview. Rabbi Hershel Gluck is a British rabbi. chairman of the Arab Jewish Forum and chairman and founder of the Muslim Jewish Forum. Jenny Manson is a British Jewish activist, author, former civil servant, former Labour Party councillor for Colindale on Barnet London Borough Council, and co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour. Thank you so much, Jenny and Rabbi Gluck, for joining.
Thank you.
I want to know what both of you felt like was being left out of the media's coverage of anti-Semitism, Israel, Zionism, being Jewish right now by the British media.
There's been a huge change for me. During the period when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader, I wasn't ignored. I was asked on a huge amount because they needed to have balance, so they called it. Before Jewish Voice for Labour was started in 2017, I was a witness, one of the 5 witnesses for somebody called Ken Livingstone, very notorious at the time, but not for being anti-Semitic. He was a very strong and radical mayor, and my admiration for him was his treatment of asylum seekers. That was one of his best qualities. I'm sure Hershel would agree. He was accused of anti-Semitism. Jeremy Corbyn was leader by then, had been leader since 2015, didn't know how to act really, and us 5 Jews gave evidence. And the panel decided that Ken Livingstone had brought the party into disrepute, but they did not find a finding of anti-Semitism. And we put out a press release, and this was my first example of being interviewed. The BBC interviewed me on their 24-hour channel, and I said something about I thought that Jews, like all cultures, had a history of compassion, and I could not understand how the chief rabbi was screaming with rage about the fact that he hadn't been found guilty of anti-Semitism, Ken. I talked a bit about false allegations. After that, we formed Jewish Voice for Labour, and along with our media officer, Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, we got a huge amount of publicity. On the BBC, one day I did about 5 interviews. I'd do one about one of the accusations against Jeremy or one of his supporters, and then they'd ask me on to another interview, and so did Naomi. And Naomi did a lot on Sky, and we did ITN. But when Mr. Starmer got rid of, not only did he win the leadership campaign, but pushed Jeremy further and further out, I was only asked one time back onto the BBC, onto a Newsnight programme, where I was shut up every time I spoke. And what I said was then reported as anti-Semitism to the Labour Party when I was talking about a book called Good News for Labour, which had made it clear that people thought 31% or 33% of Labour members, a third, were accused of anti-Semitism, guilty of it, when it was 0.05 or 0.03, and nobody was found guilty of it, really. So coming to the current day, I'll talk about that with Hershel. But our experience recently is that they really don't want to hear from us. They don't want to think they got it wrong about Jeremy and about anti-Semitism. So we were invited a few days ago onto Talk Radio after a long gap, and then they decided not to have us. We get invited and then we get dropped endlessly, repeatedly. The BBC is another story which perhaps we want to tell. It's not so much they ask us on and drop us, but they keep on attempting to silence us.
I was hoping that you could share with us what the various organizations that you're involved in do. So that would be the Jewish Muslim Forum, the Jewish Arab Forum, and Shomrim.
The Muslim Jewish Forum I had the idea in 2000, so about 24, 25 years ago, before the Twin Towers, before the world went totally mad. And it was about Muslims and Jews working together for issues of common concern, because we both live in the UK, we both work in the UK, we see the UK as our home, as British citizens. And there are a lot of issues that as minorities we share common concerns about. And so therefore, to work together for all our benefit and for the benefit of society at large, I felt that both communities can bring something to the table for each other and for society at large. And thanks God that has been the case since then, that in the UK, not only we live well together, but we actually contribute for the furtherance of each other's community as well.
And what about you, Jenny? Tell us about Jewish Voice for Labor.
Okay, and I'll tell you a bit about myself as well, maybe, because it will lead into it. I became a young socialist when I was very young. They were called the Young Socialists in those days. I was at the university. I was in the non-affiliated Labour group because the Labour Party, even in those days, was being anti-refugee by my standards. And then I was a Labour councillor and a parliamentary candidate in the 80s. Anyway, years go by, and Jeremy Corbyn stood for the leadership of the Labour Party in 2015. And I had been considered to be the soft left in the middle there somewhere. And then my elder daughter and I had a word. She's a doctor, and both my daughters agree with what I think, but she and I are more activists. And we said we're going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn because at last we've got a Labour leader who says austerity is not the right way to deal with a financial crisis. Stop making the poor pay. Well, so moved on to 2016, 2017, these accusations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party started. And you got people on the BBC assuming that all the Jewish communities, there was one large, and all of them were so shocked by Jeremy Corbyn and his anti-Semitism, his encouragement of anti-Semitism. So I wrote to various TV people and said, there's not all Jews have one view. Then we formed Jewish Voice for Labour in May of 2017 to put the point that we were Jews who did not agree with the current criticisms of Jeremy, that what we really valued was his support for the Palestinian cause, that we believe that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, and that the whole use of anti-Semitism was a terrible disadvantage to Jews, to the world, to Muslims. There was a fanatical emphasis just on anti-Semitism. Other forms of racism were ignored or even encouraged, some of us would think, by the Labour Party. And in a way, anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, was encouraged too, because people certainly hated us as Jews. So that's really where. So I'm co-chair. Became so busy, we recruited a co-chair for me because the work is more or less full time.
And what is the point of Jewish Voice for Labor?
Well, it's a very good question now because we have no connections with the Labour Party anymore. So at the time, we were a Labour Party group and it was required to be a full member and an officer. You needed to be Jewish. Then we had a huge number of supporters, called themselves Solidarity members, and they could do everything except for vote on the Constitution, and they can't be officers. But then, when Jeremy lost the leadership, a new Labour Party was formed, which really has no connection with what I believe in, and also they indiscriminately attacked Jews. So there were 67 Jews on my list of Jews accused of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. I was accused of anti-Semitism too.
And Rabbi, what are your thoughts on anti-Semitism, both how it manifests itself in England and also the way it's equated with anti-Zionism by a lot of political and media elites?
There is certainly anti-Semitism, but the anti-Semitism comes from young people or older people who are dissatisfied with their lives. The anti-Semitism doesn't come from Muslims, as the Islamophobia doesn't come from Jews. Whenever a minority is being attacked, wherever in the world, certain people who feel excluded from society, who feel disappointed with society, feel that this is an opportunity for them to give vent to their frustrations, to their anger. So therefore, the same is true when something happens to someone who's disabled, God forbid, or someone who's a member of the gay community, or someone who's a member of the black community, or someone's a member of the Muslim community, or the Jewish community. And sadly, there are those who are happy with this situation, who want anti-Semitism to grow, in order to say, see, you diaspora Jews, you're being attacked because you're in the diaspora. The truth is, Jews feel comfortable wherever we go. Sadly, there are those who have a project fear, who are trying to impose upon Jews that they should be afraid. And therefore, there are Jews who buy into this project fear, and they go out and they think everyone's there to attack them. And therefore they feel that they are under siege, even though they don't see it, but they've been brainwashed. They've been convinced by this mass hysteria that wherever you look, it's anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism is pervasive.
I wanted also to bring in, when we can in a moment, what I feel to be an increase in real anti-Semitism in England and why it's happening. And I think Herschel will probably agree, but I've been thinking about that a lot the last few days because of some experiences I've had of non-Jews being so shocked at Jews who are supporting what Israel is doing. And some of the Jews who are supporting what Israel are doing in such a really terrifyingly abusive way, in a way that I'm frightened of anti-Semitism happening in a way. I'm not personally frightened. As Herschel says, I've never had any physical threat to me. In fact, I've met nothing but, as you say, love. So why the media covers it was the weapon to get rid of Jeremy. And I think, Jeremy's not a particularly left-wing socialist. He's just a good socialist and a good man. So the media seemed to me to be in a kind of conspiracy. And when I had a meeting at the BBC with another senior Labour figure, this person said to me, when I received quite a lot of passive aggression, I suppose, from the head of politics or somebody senior, don't you realise how much the Guardian and the BBC, the so-called protectors of the left of centre in Britain, they long for a Starmer sort of leadership. They don't want any more of these threatening Jeremys.
And what do you think about this claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism?
Well, yes, going back to Jeremy's leadership again, it seemed to coincide, it was not much longer after, the complete mythology about anti-Zionism and anti-criticism of Israel being anti-Semitic. I quote, who wouldn't, a very eminent Jewish judge, Sir Stephen Sedley, who says that anti-Semitism is hostility towards Jews. What you feel about Israel is nothing to do with hostility towards Jews, as you know, but as you know, the IHRA, and I won't go into the detail, but a definition which its writer Kenneth Stern, who's an American now completely disowned, has become the byword for if you don't support it, you're anti-Semitic, and this has hit our universities and our governments. As Herschel says, this is nothing to do with Jews. This is to do with the defense that Israel has managed to provide itself with its supporters, the Hasbara propaganda movement. And people often say to me, why do I bother criticizing the Parliamentary Labour Party in relation to Jeremy? It was all about Israel. It may have been, but the two things coincided. Somehow, Jeremy and the people around him, there's some very good, it's not just him, some very good other, few there are, but Labour MPs who stood for what I would call socialism, an ethical look at politics. Issues like refugees being treated ethically rather than trying to subsume the far right, which is what's happening now. But there was an alliance between their views and this conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And to be fair to the BBC, journalists that Herschel knows as well, did provide a program on Sunday, which is a religious program some years ago, where a rabbi friend of ours called Danny Rich and one of these Labour MPs explained their view that anti-Zionism was not anti-Semitism, and the opponent that they found on the program, they only found one person to argue against, was probably quite well argued out. I think most rational arguing people realize that there is no connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. There can be, but there's no intrinsic connection. So that some of the most, in a way, the most Jewish of Jews, whatever that means, Jews who are most aware of what anti-Semitism is, like Tony Greenstein, who you may be interviewing later, they know what anti-Semitism is, and they know, and they can be very, very powerful anti-Zionists. But this Mr. Apprehension, there may be a turn, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the present day, and I don't know what Herschel feels, but I'm hearing of the views of Jews in my area and some other areas. I live in North London, where Jews are saying things like, oh, Israel's such a small country, it must be protected, it must be allowed to carry out war crimes. And people hearing this are very shocked. So is this the beginning of a new anti-Semitism? I'm asking you both, really. There is a sense out there. How comes there's double standards? We have Assad's torture chambers and we have Israel's torture chambers, but different standards are being applied to the two things. So people say, I'm careful when I'm saying this because I don't want to be in any way calling us, but the people say, why are Jews so powerful? Is that why the stories are getting double standards? And then we say, no, we're not powerful, but sometimes the establishment uses Jews. Is that what I don't know. I'm throwing it back to you both. This is such sensitive matter, but I've had a lifetime of seeing very little anti-Semitism, as I repeat. And I'm now hearing of examples which are children at school hearing worrying things of that nature. Jews are too powerful.
I mean, I know I'll pass it to you, Rabbi, but I just want to say one thing. I mean, for myself, I do think that Israel's actions, when Israel live streams what I consider to be genocide and says that it's doing it in the name of Jews, I think that does contribute to anti-Semitism.
People need to have the right to defend themselves and to be protected. That doesn't give a right to deny other people their human rights and undermine international law. Don't forget, after the Second World War, when over 100 members of my family were murdered, one of the saving issues was that after the war, we felt we made international law, international human rights to protect us, that it shouldn't happen again. And when there are those who quite blatantly say that international law doesn't apply, and they bring proof from what happened during the Second World War that one can behave in a manner which is contrary to international law, so then they are destroying the safeguards for the Jewish community that these type of atrocities should, God forbid, not happen again.
Another question for you is I know that you said that the claim of pro-Palestine protests being no-go zones for Jews is total and utter fiction. That's a quote of yours. Can you expand on that?
There are thousands of Jews who participate in those marches. So therefore, and they feel 100% safe. And friends of mine who look like me tell me that when they walk past the marches, and these are people who are not anti-Zionists by any stretch of the imagination, they're just observant Jews who are not Zionists or not anti-Zionists, they say that people are friendly, people engage, they don't feel any antagonism, any anti-Semitic sentiment, or any anti-Semitic actions. So therefore, this Project Fear that certain people are trying to impose upon society, they're trying to make people think a certain way, which is contrary to reality. We need to wake up, smell the coffee, and consider that we need to have a honest perspective on what is happening. Because if not, we are going to actually create that very negativity that we are told exists and in reality doesn't exist.
And what do you all think about the crackdowns that are happening right now? I mean, I interviewed Chaim Bershith Zabner, who was arrested over comments he made. He, of course, is the son of 2 Holocaust survivors. He's also a historian. He's written about the Israeli army. He was raised in Israel. He was arrested. Asa Winstanley, of course, the journalist, his home was raided. There are many more people, and some of them, ironically, of course, are Jewish.
I think what's important to remember is that it's totally disproportionate that most of the people who are being arrested and are being clamped into jail are Jews. It's totally disproportionate, and therefore, and they're saying that they're doing this out of love for Israel. So therefore, we see that there's something deeply wrong in society, that whilst on one hand they're saying they're doing this out of love for Jews, in reality they are persecuting Jews. In reality, they are treating Jews in an anti-Semitic manner, and there are those who are allowing them to get away with this, and they're even applauding this. And they are the real Jew haters. They are the people who are self-hating Jews by supporting the persecution of Jews in England, in the United States, and in other parts of the world. And as people who profess to love Jews, we should be the first ones to ensure that Jews are not persecuted and Jews are not being treated with discrimination as we see today. We need to make sure that we get out of a mentality which is a negative mentality and have a positive mentality.
I wanted to I quite agree, and we know the people involved, and it did seem disproportionate. I mean, I think the statistics suggest they are, but it's a widening move to the right, I fear. We've copied legislation that other countries have. We talk about terrorism when it suits us to. You know, it's interesting. Somebody pointed out to me today that the British government is now talking to what used to be known as the terrorists in Syria. But when Jeremy was supposed to have said, friends, sit down, to Hamas, we use terrorism. You know, many people would call Israel a terrorist state, and it probably did start with 9/11. And we haven't talked very much about the American involvement in what's going on. But I feel that as regards what's happening in Israel and possibly what's happening in anti-terrorist legislation, we do need just the shift in America that we're not going to get. But I do think it's an international issue. And we haven't talked about the move to the right, but it is this legislation. The Labour Party of 20 years ago would not have allowed this legislation to go ahead. The legislation is being used at the moment, that if you say anything about Hamas on the 7th of October, you're justifying them. If you say that there was an origin to what happened, like remember the UN Secretary General said it wasn't in a vacuum. I think that's the kind of language that can get you arrested for terrorism. I mean, this is the movement. We aren't there yet. I don't want to get too. British society has still got a huge number of critics and debates going on, but there is a move. This is the other reason for the pleasure in being with all of you and being on the marches, because there is a rebellion, but we are facing a rightist regime here. And
I want to know if you guys want to share, because there's the claim that all Jews support Israel, all Jews are fans of Israel, and of course this, in my opinion, is very anti-Semitic for various reasons, and I think leans into the dual loyalty trope. What are your thoughts of Israel? And have you ever been Israel supporters? And if so, have you had a kind of evolution in your thinking on Israel?
My mother lived in Palestine. She lived in Palestine, and then she came over in 1929, a long time ago. I went between school and I had a gap year before I went to university, and I went to visit my mother's family. Two of her brothers stayed in. Her sisters all came to England, the brothers stayed in. And I was very shocked almost immediately by the hierarchy even among Jews there. I was told, don't go with an Iraqi Jew, because I had went out with an Iraqi Jew, and the way they treated Palestinians. And the disillusionment started then. But I remained up until the 1990s and early 2000 uncomfortable with non-Jews who were too critical of Israel. I wasn't pleased with myself, but I couldn't cope with that transition. But then the Intifada and Gaza wide exact dates, but around the 2000 period, an organization called Jews for Justice for Palestinians was formed here. And to start with, we talked among Jews, and then that thing cracked suddenly, and I no longer had that defensive feeling. So it's been quite slow with me. By the way, there was no conversation about Zionism in my household. Some of my ancestors. So the conversation about anti-Zionism and Zionism is not really my conversation, because I've never been a Zionist, and I now consider it's how people treat Palestinian human rights that matters more than whether they call themselves a Zionist. So that's mine. I'm ashamed of the fact that I argued with people in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. People like Wada Kami, who's now a friend of mine.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating discussion, and I'm really grateful to both of you for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for watching The Katie Halper Show. Make sure you become Patreon supporters at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show so that you get to watch the full interview with Tony Greenstein. That's at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Please become subscribers by hitting subscribe and then the bell. And please like the stream if you haven't already. That's just a really easy way to support the show and get the show out there. Have a very happy new year, and we will see you next year. Bye, everyone.
Okay, I'm down.